Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being in your seats on time, and don't make me sing to get you seated. We are very delighted this morning to have a wonderful program for you. And of course, we must start with music. So I bring back to the stage San Miguel and Cecilia Noel.
Good morning, everyone. What a pleasure to be here again in front of Mr. President. I don't see Rosalynn this morning. Oh, she's there. Oh, very nice to see you again. Very nice to be here. Lovely. So much information for us. So dearing and so endearing to us to be here again and share your stories and be part of this wonderful forum. Thank you very much. This is San Miguel. De Alto Cedro voy para Macaney, llego a Cueto voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Macaney, llego a Cueto voy para Mayarí. El cariño que te tengo no te lo puedo negar. El cariño que te tengo no te lo puedo negar. Se me sale la babita, yo no lo puedo evitar. Vamos a Miguel. De Alto Cedro voy para Macaney, llego a Cueto voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Macaney, llego a Cueto voy para Mayarí. Limpia el camino de pajas que yo me quiero sentar. Limpia el camino de pajas que yo me quiero sentar en aquel tronco que veo y así no puedo llegar. De Alto Cedro voy para Macaney, llego a Cueto voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Macaney, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Macaney, llego a Cueto voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Macaney, llego a Cueto voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Macaney, llego a Cueto voy para Mayarí. Thank you very much. Sing with us. Everybody needs some love today. Everybody needs un poquito de amor every day. Everybody needs some love today. Everybody needs un poquito de amor every day. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to San Miguel and Cecilia Noel for another wonderful performance. And we are delighted to be joined this morning by the Foreign Minister of Sweden, who is with us by Skype.
Yes, hello.
Good morning. Good morning. Foreign Minister Margot Wallström has placed human rights, especially women's rights, at the top of Sweden's foreign policy agenda. And so it's an honor for us to hear from Foreign Minister Wallström about Sweden's role as a global leader on human rights, on women's rights, and on women's empowerment. And I should say, too, that President Carter and the Carter Center have worked hard to highlight the lessons from Sweden's pioneering work to combat human trafficking and help women exit the sex trade. I think all of us realize that violence against women is integrally related to the normalization of violence in society, while conversely, the advancement of women is a key to peace and progress. So welcome, Minister. Thanks so much for joining us. We're very much looking forward to your insights. The floor is yours, Madam Minister.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear friends, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on how progressive foreign policy can renew our commitment to peace and human rights. Thank you for mentioning that we have, and I have declared a feminist foreign policy. And what that means is actually that we pursue the rights representative and resource agenda for a feminist foreign policy, meaning that we adopt a action plan every year and ask our embassies to be active in checking that women enjoy the same rights, that have a voice and are represented, and that resources are attributed also to their needs. And I can tell you more about that later, but I would say that human rights and the commitments to peace and human rights are under raising attacks from politicians, populists, and groups that openly oppose multilateralism and strive for nationalism and protectionism. And throughout the world, we see how the space for human rights, democracy, and respect for the rule of law shrinks. Some argue that under these circumstances, we should lower our ambitions and that it is not realistic to push for universal protection of human rights. But let me be very clear today, human rights are not based on idealism. Universal human rights remain one of our most essential tools to guarantee all women and men their fundamental rights. But it will require all of us to stand up and defend these human rights at a time when they are on decline. We should work together to ensure that our obligations to promote and protect universal human rights are fully and equally implemented, and multilateralism remains our main tool for guaranteeing this. Sweden recently published our own human rights reports, and they paint a very big picture. And let me give you two such examples. They show that freedom of opinion is under attack in almost all regions of the world. And the trend of strengthened democracies that since the end of the Cold War has been expanding has now stopped or even turned negative. I would like to mention 4 areas of special importance to human rights: opinion and expression, freedom of opinion and expression, the rule of law, peace and security, and maybe something about what is Sweden's role in strengthening human rights. And of course, freedom of opinion and expression, transparency, and access to information are fundamental for democratic societies. Today, we see a repressive media climate, including repressive legislation, where disinformation and propaganda go hand in hand with deteriorating working conditions for journalists, and especially women journalists. Last year, Sweden celebrated the 250 years anniversary of the Swedish Freedom of the Press Act, and the act abolished censorship of all printed publications and guaranteed public access to official documents and the right and opportunity to engage in political debate. That act, the Freedom of the Press Act, has played a pivotal role in the development of the modern Swedish society. We're convinced that the only way forward is to promote protect and defend freedom of opinion and expression. Democracy thrives when a plurality of voices are heard. The protection of human rights is directly linked to upholding the rule of law. In some countries, state power is concentrated in the hands of just a few people, and authorities serve governments instead of acting neutrally under the law. Governments are in many places limiting the independence of the judiciary, and institutions are called into question, even where they have traditionally enjoyed a strong position. And lack of protection of law means lack of protection of human rights. It is deplorable that these rights are being restricted, even in some European countries where people have been fighting for decades. Human rights remain the best guarantor for peace and security. They are relevant across the entire conflict cycle, before, during, and after, and further efforts are needed in all three phases. Before, because a failure to protect human rights erodes trust and increases fear, suspicion, and exclusion, and that sows the seeds of instability and conflict. Adding to this, the correlation between conflict and the discrimination of women has been established, making upholding women's human rights so extremely concerned. During conflicts, respect for international law, including human rights law and international humanitarian law, must be upheld. And the trend is, unfortunately, the complete opposite. Monitoring and reporting of all human rights is crucial. And after a conflict, human rights are essential for consolidating peace and emerging from conflict. A comprehensive human rights framework that ensures that the rights of all individuals are recognized, respected, and protected is critical to sustain peace. I'd better check if you hear me okay, or if this, does it work?
Yes, it does, Minister. Thank you.
Okay. So let me finish by then highlighting just a few concrete actions that my government has taken regarding human rights. First, we appointed, as one of the first things we did, an ambassador for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, responsible for promoting our policy and coordinating our actions on these issues. Secondly, in December, we presented a communication to the Swedish Parliament describing also our priorities in the work for better protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And it was actually the first communication addressing these three correlating areas in an integrated manner. And thirdly, just a few weeks ago, we published 135 country reports on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And of course, we made them public. And this is the first time since 2010 that the FA published reports from all regions of the world at the same time. And moreover, it is the first time that the reports highlight democracy and the rule of law so clearly alongside human rights. So these actions, together with our everyday work to promote human rights through our embassies within and together with the EU, at the UN and elsewhere, for the solid base from which we strive to enhance the living conditions of people all over the world. And we will continue to be a strong advocate for human rights, respect for rule of law and democracy. And in a world where the development sometimes seems to be moving in the wrong direction, it is essential to maintain the principles upon which we have agreed. And this is important whether the discussion is in the United Nations, European Union, or our country. So thank you for listening to me for so long, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments, and happy to be with you, even if I would have preferred to be there in person, but it's also fine. I see you clearly, and the President looks as young as ever.
Thank you so much, Minister. President Carter?
We thank you for appearing before us this morning. It means a lot to have, a country like Sweden setting an example for the rest of the world. And I think you're elevating human rights as a key foundation for your entire foreign policy has been a signal that it's no longer abandoned, but it's going to be resumed all over the world. So thank you for the leadership that you've exhibited personally and what your great country has done also for human rights. in the long past and also in the future. Thank you very much for coming to be with us this morning.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. It will be, I think, a difficult struggle, because if until now you see the lonely polar bear on a piece of ice has been the symbol of what climate change, the changing environment will do to the world, I think the symbol of the way the shrinking space for people who defend human rights and democracy and freedom of speech might be a defender of women's rights, for example, behind bars or in front of a gun. That's reality now. So I think we have a new symbol for what is at stake here also. And we have to admire all those around the world who fight to defend, especially free speech. And journalists are being killed and persecuted all around the world. So it's important that we stand together to fight for this right.
If you have a chance to come to the United States and make the same speech to the general public, we would really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm happy to come.
Minister, we have a number of the people you referred to, the defenders of human rights on the front lines, here in this room with us. So now I'd like to open the floor to questions from our participants. Yeah, 2 or 3 if you have time, Minister?
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself.
Can I? Thank you very much, Minister. First, on behalf of all human rights defenders, I would like to thank you, Sweden, for taking out your country is in the lead role for human rights defenders in EU, and I'm also happy to say that the guidelines which EU have prepared for the human rights defender. So that guidelines, I would like your country, your flagship, and you are now on that, the human rights defenders on front line in EU, if these guidelines can be made practical, because human rights defenders, countries from like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and other countries, we human rights defenders sometimes feeling like this is issue when we are go for even for trainings or any kind of visas. So these guidelines has to be made practical. Thank you very much.
The problem, Julian, the only problem is that we don't have the ability to translate for the foreign minister right now. But can I get questions written out and we can transmit? Is okay? Is okay?
Unless you speak Swedish.
Yeah, or English. Okay.
Minister has perhaps a comment on
Yes.
on Rehana's intervention.
Can you just repeat them? Because it was about the guidelines that the European Union works on, or did I understand? Can you summarize the question to me, please?
Human rights defenders guideline by EU, it's excellent guidelines. But when it comes to implementation, most of the mission in countries like us, they are unaware of them, and sometimes they are not practically implemented.
That was Rehana Hashmi from Pakistan. Can you hear us, Foreign Minister? Yes, that was Rehana Hashmi from Pakistan asking about the EU guidelines that the governments are not implementing them.
I am sure that sometimes the guidelines that the European Union issues can be difficult to implement, and I'm not sure exactly what guidelines you're referring to. I think that, the whole European Union of is a union based on common values and ideas. This is the strength of the European Union, and this is also what we try to express the way we work with development or development assistance or other projects with with the countries bilaterally or multilaterally. And I think that dialogue will be crucial also for the future to continue to argue about our values. We can see the tendency that, of course, commercial or economic interests take over and then cease to put the human rights issues to the side. But I think we have to continue to insist on making human rights and these sort of values and the value base that we have, put it at the center of cooperation also with other countries. For this question, because it gives me an opportunity to explain, first of all, sort of the feminist foreign policy that I initially also explained is based on checking through our embassies, through everything we do consistently, ask where are the women, what about their rights to work against discrimination of women, to make sure that resources are also distributed to women. So that's the method and the attitude that we have in working for feminism. On top of that, we work to establish, for example, a network of women mediators and negotiators. And we have also, for example, made sure that women can sit around the table when peace negotiations happen on Syria in Geneva. So these are some of the results. Is easy to explain because it has to do with everything from getting countries to rally around the call for action against violence against women, to prevent female genital mutilation, to work for sexual and reproductive health issues around the world, and we can see a lot of concrete results. The reality is that around the world today, there are so many countries that still discriminate against women. And of course, Saudi Arabia is one example where we are very far away from each other when it comes to women's rights, guaranteeing women's rights in our legislation and in practice in our societies. And I know that I have so publicly criticized when Saudi Arabia acts against women's rights and wants to promote a change in policies towards more of gender equality also in Saudi Arabia. What the debate that has happened recently has to do with the Commission on the Status of Women. And that is, as you know, a UN body. And this has to do with the universality of the United Nations. All countries of the United Nations. It also means that they can choose to be in subcommittees in different UN bodies, including the Commission on the Status of Women. And in that committee sits 45 countries, and they are sort of rotated in through regional elections and nominations. And recently, there was also elected new members to the commission. In that commission sits already, for example, Russia, Belarus, there is Iran, there is Pakistan, there are a number of countries, also European countries, that if you would use criteria of having an ambitious gender policy, they would probably not be members of that commission. And I think very few will be left in the committee. But this is not how it works. Of course, you have almost a fourth of all the countries in the world in that commission. So we were asked about, because for once there was a vote in the commission when they were appointed, and we were asked how did we vote. And normally we accept that we don't say how we vote in the UN context, because if we would also see pressure from some big member states that would always ask and pressure on smaller countries, and it would make it impossible. So we said we follow those rules. We accept that this is now the situation, but we don't reveal how we vote. You have to see that we have to do both. We need to work for an ambitious policy through UN Women and through the United Nations. And to be perfectly honest, of those who are not even sort of members, like the Vatican, plays a very important role in that commission. It means that the debate is ongoing. But we continue to work with feminist foreign policy. We continue to criticize also countries like Saudi Arabia when we think that they should be more ambitious and work for guaranteeing women's rights, as with other countries in that commission. And unfortunately, it is not a criterion that you have to have an ambitious gender policy or female foreign policy to or feminist foreign policy to sit on that commission. But this is exactly what has happened. We will continue to work also bilaterally with that country and other countries to convince them to move with a more ambitious policy, so for gender equality.
Foreign Minister, we have one more question for you. It was in French, and I offered to read it out. But this is conveying a sentiment that was discussed much here during our 4 days together, asking Sweden and other countries that support human rights with their programming and their financing to consider adopting your procedures for financing the support of human rights. There are a lot of problems, and we can send you a brief report from this forum with some ideas that we hope you will consider. This came from Julienne Lusange of the Congo, who told us yesterday that despite her testimony to the UN Security Council 3 times, that things are actually getting worse for women in the programs that she operates. So we will send you a report. There are other questions here we don't have time to give you, but I'm going to ask our participants to write down your questions, and if it's all right, we will send you these questions and give you the opportunity to answer them when you are able. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Ambassador Peters.
Minister, do you have anything to add?
If you send me questions, I'll be happy to answer to all of them as best I can. Can I use this opportunity to say thank you to President Carter for the work on also the work against prostitution and trafficking, because I think this is another fight that we have to take now, and we have to make sure that we continue to work for abolition of prostitution, and that we use that word, and don't start to use the word sex work, because I really think that in the same moment it will be so much more difficult to address the issue of trafficking and abuse of human beings. And I know that you have congratulated us on the sex buyers legislation that we have, and we are grateful for this.
Well, thank you very much, Foreign Minister. We will continue this effort using Sweden as a model for the other countries to emulate. And we've made some progress in France and Canada and others, as you may know, but we'll continue this all over the world in the next few years. We won't give up, and I'm sure you won't either. Thank you.
Thank you. And France is also making progress, so it's fantastic to hear from them. And others will follow, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Foreign Minister Wallström, on behalf of all of us gathered with President Carter at the Carter Center, and particularly the defenders of human rights from countries around the world, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us your perspectives and your counsel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Me, and all the best with your important meeting, and good luck. Thank you for everything you do. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're closing the Skype. Yeah, got it. It's closed up there. So. Thank you very much. That was great, and I mean it. If you please write down your questions, hand them to me, and we will get them to the foreign minister's staff, and I think that was quite a good discussion.
Now, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. No.
Am I going to introduce?
Yes, I was
Yeah.
going to introduce you.
All right. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Assistant Secretary General Andrew Gilmore, who is representing the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Andrew, if I may, assumed his functions as Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights last October, and he heads the office in New York. His previous position was as Director for Political, Peacekeeping, Humanitarian, and Human Rights Affairs in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. Mr. Gilmore was responsible for spearheading the implementation of the Human Rights Upfront Initiative, whose purpose, as I understand it, is to ensure that the UN system takes early and effective action to prevent or respond to large-scale violations of human rights or international humanitarian law. Since joining the UN in 1989, Assistant Secretary General Gilmore has held a variety of positions, as I know you realize, both at UN headquarters and in the field, including in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kosovo, Palestine, and West Africa. And in recent years, he has served as Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General in Iraq and in South Sudan, and as well in Belgrade. So please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary General Gilmore.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And First Lady and Mr. President, thank you for your inspirational leadership and for this initiative. At the UN, as my friend Jordan can corroborate, your name is still an icon for commitment, courage, truth, and human rights, 40 years after your election. I don't like normally to flatter audiences. I find it normally it's more stimulating to have a, and sort of edgy to have to provoke a bit. But in this audience, in this group, how can one do anything other than salute the astonishing commitment and courage it takes to be a human rights defender in so many of the countries that are represented here today. Now, we've heard yesterday, I was only here yesterday, not before, but I heard many moving accounts and some harrowing threats as well. So many setbacks to the human rights struggle. France, as the foreign minister has just mentioned, of Sweden has mentioned, is an exception. And indeed, on Sunday night, I wrote something thanking the French for their thumping victory over vindictive and xenophobic populism, and saying, now France, and now France, may you do for the Anglo-Saxons what they did for you in 1944. Now, of course, I didn't mean the D-Day landings, but I was talking about the form of national liberation and a restoration of national honor and values. So France has given a goosebumps moment, a human rights goosebumps moment, and there haven't really been very many of those in the past year. But one I would like to mention, and that was in January. It was an astonishing thing, watching thousands of American human rights defenders and lawyers flock to the airports to protest the cruel and infamous Muslim immigration ban, and to protect those most in need and to provide solidarity, and also to actually restore faith in America's goodness and indeed humanity. So that was a rare goosebumps moment, and unfortunately we're going to need a lot more of those for what's coming down the road, I think, and not just in the US, of course. One of the great illusions and myths propagated by repressive regimes, both at the UN and in their homes, is that somehow human rights are a threat to security, and that conversely repressing human rights promotes security, particularly in an era of growing terrorism and violent extremism. Now, our view at the UN Human Rights Office, not surprisingly, is precisely the opposite. We believe that failure to uphold freedoms, failure to have a rule of law, what it might do is drive tensions underground, but only not in any way that actually preserves order, merely in a way that might explode later far more dangerously. And this is something that is clearly the number of countries who push back with us, it's growing all the time and use these arguments, and it's worrying. So human rights are threatened from so many different ways, and I won't list them, other than perhaps the issue of civil society organizations and how difficult it is to register and fund and to operate. Yesterday, Anne talked very movingly about the foreign agents law in Russia, but there are many other countries where Haggai of B'Tselem knows all too well in Israel, and there's also Ethiopia, Kenya, India, Turkey, Egypt. All of these have passed hard human rights laws. So civil society isn't just shrinking, it is, as Mariam said yesterday about Bahrain, is closed altogether. And Stefania told us yesterday some of the grotesque threats that are issued against human rights defenders in Hungary, and Julien also in the Congo. We, of course, operate on the assumption that a state's treatment of civil society is a litmus test of its commitment to human rights. And the breadth of democratic space shows whether a government is actually a servant of its people, in the service of its people, or if it's actually a predator, more intent on just suppressing freedom and suppressing dissent and just staying in power indefinitely. So how can the UN help? With all our imperfections that I'm sure some of you will point out to me after I finish speaking, how can we support civil society in this hour of need? And I would like to briefly mention 4 initiatives that are underway at the moment. I don't want to oversell them, but I do believe they are all important. The first is a general effort led by our office, the Human Rights Office, to support civil society. And this goes in many ways, offering legal advice, providing capacity building, producing some practical tools of advice, lessons learned, best practices. Also facilitating civil society engagement with special rapporteurs from the UN and the treaty body visits, seeking to foster dialogue between state actors and civil society. That we do a lot of that, and also getting civil society together in places where it has often been hard to do that. And I have many examples of that I've seen and participated in my own trips, especially in Africa. Plus, there is also the support of a legal framework, and this is a consistent thing we are now doing. And to mention in my recent trip to the Democratic Republic of Congo, I didn't have one meeting, whether it was with the government officials, whether it was in every media interview, or the President of the Senate, or the President of the National Assembly, where I didn't push the importance of the law for human rights defenders, which is in draft form, and the need to have a law for freedom of assembly. So trying to register support the legal framework for civil society is something that is increasingly a priority for us. Secondly, and Marianne kindly mentioned this, is the Human Rights Upfront initiative that the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon launched, actually as a response to our manifest failures to do more to prevent the terrible killings, tens of thousands in Sri Lanka in 2009, and where we just the killings were not our fault, but we definitely did not respond well, and we did a major soul searching and lessons learned to see how we can do better in future. And that's called the Human Rights Upfront Initiative. And the aim is to get really the whole system, because of the many, many thousands of people who work for the UN in various forms, only about 3% work directly for human rights. So our aim is to get the other 97 to understand that human rights is also part of their work as well, even if it's not exactly in their job description as peacekeepers or as development aid. Still, human rights is what they're doing. To try to get them to work together, to try to get them to have a common analysis of what the threats to human rights might be. And I think this has actually been quite a successful initiative, and we have really managed to have some form of cultural change within the UN, to get people to speak up more frankly, to show greater moral courage, even when it leads to having a serious problem with your host government. We're not trying to train people to kamikaze, to get instantly persona non grata, but we are trying to raise the bar, and I feel that we've had a little bit of success on that front. And of course, all this involves working with CSOs. The third initiative, and many of you will be at least as familiar with it as I am, is the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which we believe offer significant entry points to further realize freedom from fear and freedom from want. Because it's for all people, without discrimination, and using the overarching vision of leaving no one behind. And as countries seek to implement their sustainable development goals and their targets, it is absolutely crucial that they engage with civil society, and that we, you, and assisted by us, need to work with them to ensure that they meet the commitments that they voluntarily signed up to. Goal 16 of the 17 SDGs on peaceful, just, and inclusive societies embeds many dimensions of civil and political rights, including the ending of all forms of violence, ending abuse, and exploitation, and trafficking, torture. And one of the indicators for Goal 16, and this is a very important point for this group, I believe, is explicitly spelled out that one of the indicators is that states have to be judged on their progress in reducing the number of killings, disappearances, tortures, and reprisals against trade union activists, journalists, and human rights defenders. So we believe, because it's also important to bear in mind that governments are far happier to talk about the SDGs than they are to talk about human rights. So, as I said, because they've all agreed to that, and sustainable development is something they all sign up to, human rights does not appear as explicitly as some people would have liked, but it is definitely there implicitly. So I very much feel that we all need to use that as a narrow opening to push for something much, much broader, and I'm optimistic that we can do that. And then the fourth initiative I wanted to mention concerns reprisals. Now, talking to civil society for all the UN, but particularly the human rights people, is absolutely crucial. We're not there in most countries. We need your testimony. We need your advice on how to proceed. But as you know better than we do, far too often, brave civil society activists who have engaged with the UN have had to pay sometimes a terrible price. And there are many forms of reprisal. They can be relatively minor, like a short-term travel ban, or it can be much, much more serious. And, of course, there have also been deaths as well. This is a growing problem, and we are determined to do something about that. And last October, the Secretary General, and this was the first ever, announced that he had asked somebody, actually it was me, to lead a system-wide effort to address this growing problem. And what we're trying to do with this is to, first of all, get as much information as possible. And I know there's much more of it that goes on than we're aware of, and we would welcome your inputs on that, and we'll find a way of circulating our address, because we need to know more. We know it's happening, but we're not getting that many cases of it. And it's explicitly people who suffer for having cooperated with the UN, which is an outrageous thing, of course, because cooperating with the UN means cooperating with institutions, whether it's special procedures or treaty bodies that have been actually set up by the member states, but then people are punished for cooperating with that. So we are working on a number of fronts. I'm raising with individual ambassadors in New York, individual cases, and we're trying to get a more sort of general, coherent way of dealing with this terrible scourge. And then we'll be doing it both, as I said, in the form of quiet diplomacy, but also publicly, and I will be presenting a report on this to both in Geneva, the Human Rights Council, and to the General Assembly this autumn. So these are some of the areas that we're trying to do things. And we are up, of course, against this growing perception, this perverse logic that the way to react to terrorism is to crack down on freedoms and intensify discrimination, even bring back torture, and basically humiliate and alienate those ethnic and religious groups who might otherwise be very much in the forefront of combating terrorism, but actually driving them into terrorist arms in the most extraordinarily counterproductive way possible. Since the root causes of so many grievances that lie behind all forms of violence, whether it's civil conflict or demonstrations or terrorism itself, since the root causes lie in exclusion and discrimination, it is clear that human rights, not just for moral reasons, but for practical reasons, needs to be at the forefront of policy making. Now, it's also pretty clear to me that President Carter was the first world leader to fully appreciate this point. I actually joined the human rights movement in a very junior, minor way. I'm joining Amnesty International during his presidency. And just at the beginning, and in no small part, thanks to him, at the beginning of this massive revolution and a very beneficent explosion of human rights that has did last for about 3 decades. We have now hit, clearly, we're experiencing a backlash. Now, I'm a historian by training, but I don't have a worldview of history that believes that progress is inevitable. Now, it's tempting to believe that in this sort of march of progress towards human rights, this is a temporary blip, a setback that will in time be circumvented. I would like to believe that, but I'm not sure it is the case. And the only way we can ensure that it would be the case is to redouble our efforts and to ensure that that progress continues. Yesterday, Mariam mentioned that women human rights defenders in her part of the world don't need saving, they need solidarity and support. And that also that those who are privileged have a duty, have a responsibility to provide that support. And I could not agree more with that. And of course, those of us working for the UN are undeniably privileged. So it is certainly not for somebody from the UN, we're not on the front lines of human rights defense after all, it's certainly not for us to exhort you to take even greater risks, to show even greater heroism, to expose yourself to even greater reprisals. So our role, though, is to show solidarity and, moral solidarity and practical support. So we are trying to up our game in this regard and to make that support more meaningful and effective. We too face obstacles, and they are actually from the same source as the obstacles you face. It's those governments that are threatening you and removing your rights are also putting many obstacles in our way, where it could be either just removing our budget, which is a particularly well-known tactic, or just creating difficulties at every step of the way. And a number of governments are doing that with the Human Rights Office at the moment. There's been nothing, I've never seen anything like it actually, and I've been observing it for decades. There's an increased pressure on us to prevent our assistance to you. But we are genuinely determined to do something and to circumvent those obstacles. And it is going to be a difficult journey, and mainly for you, of course. All I can say is that we are profoundly and sincerely going to be with you on that. Thank you very much.
Andrew, can I ask a question? Well, when I came home from the from the White House and organized the Carter Center, we tried to analyze what the United Nations needed to be more effective in protecting and promoting human rights. And we were in the forefront of creating the High Commission on Human Rights, despite the fact that Boutros Ghali was strongly against it. And we ultimately were able to prevail on that, and the High Commission was established. Later, we saw the need to help establish the International Criminal Court, and the Carter Center was one of the leaders in promoting that establishment. And then few years ago, I went to New York and met with 25 of the key people who were trying to change the United Nations Committee on Human Rights to the Council on Human Rights, hoping that would be a major change. Privately or publicly, I'd like to know what you think as an integral part of that process that we could do to improve the implementation by the United Nations of human rights principles, even though you have opposition from some of the violators within the United Nations who are very, very, very influential. And I also would like to ask specifically, what prevents the United Nations peacekeepers in a place like Congo from also being committed or charged with the responsibility of enforcing human rights, particularly the protection of women and girls. And I understand that peacekeeping forces in some countries are restrained from taking an active role to prevent human rights abuse, even if they see it happening before them. So what is it that prevents the United Nations from instructing the human rights peacekeepers from enforcing human rights?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll take your second question first on why peacekeepers. One of the, actually I've said, in fact, in public, that the single most positive change in the UN, in my view, has been the move towards what you're suggesting. And that's the protection of civilians mandate. Until 15 years ago, there was almost no instance where peacekeepers were mandated in their Security Council provided mandate to go out and protect civilians in a substantial way. And this did enormous damage, not obviously mainly to the people who suffered, but it did huge damage to the credibility of the UN, Srebrenica being the most emblematic example. But it is pretty uphill work, to be honest. I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time in South Sudan recently, and we are definitely doing things that were never done before. And I believe that the single act since 1945 taken by anybody in the UN was the decision to open the gates in South Sudan, which, had that not happened on the night of between the 15th and the 18th of December 2014, there would have been tens of thousands of people, and there would have been bodies piled up against the outer perimeter, which until then had been the policy when people fled to a UN compound. I don't mean it's not a refugee camp, but a military compound. The issue had always been, well, come near the gates and we will try to protect you. Luckily, the decision in this case was taken to open the gates, and people came in, and that saved thousands of lives. The downside is that 3 years on, we still have 200,000 people living in miserable conditions inside those camps and are unable to leave. But at least there has been, it's far from perfect, but at least there is now a very conscious effort to protect human rights by peacekeepers. There were some terrible instances before South Sudan became independent, where massacres took place just a few hundred yards away from UN barracks, and one suspects they knew pretty well what was going on there. That has at least been got away from. But one of the problems is that although they are under UN command, effectively, soldiers, they still keep, they come in brigades and battalions from their countries of origin, and they follow orders. And this is a huge problem, and the last Secretary General felt so passionately about this that they were called caveats, whereby peacekeepers are sent, and there may be a policy taken by the mission, but there's been another instruction sent by their army headquarters back home, telling them not to get engaged. And we are really working on this. A long way to go, but I do feel there has been progress.
Well, I was really referring to South Sudan, because I've seen several programs on television recently, on the NewsHour and also perhaps on 60 Minutes, I've forgotten which, where United Nations peacekeeping forces stood obviously idle by while right in front of them terrible human rights abuses were taking place. You say it's because they still are under the orders of their host country, and the United Nations doesn't have any authority to change those orders for restraint?
The case I think you're referring to, Mr. President, was last July, and this was a deplorable case of people standing by and not coming to the aid of actually NGOs who were raped and a local journalist killed. And we have, that's led to a great deal of soul searching, and the force commander was sacked. He didn't take a proactive role. I don't think we've ever had a case of a force commander being sacked for having failed to protect civilians before. I don't particularly, it's this live stream, I don't particularly want to mention the countries in particular, but I mean, one very, very powerful country opponent, member of the Security Council, had all their soldiers ran away and leaving their weapons. And I mean, and that's a really powerful member state of the UN. So it's, yes, and they were, even if they weren't following a direct order from their capital to run away, they were clearly following some instruction that the key point is force protection. You don't get killed, protecting civilians.
Well, my question is, what can be done about it? We know the problem exists, but is there something specifically that we could help?
I mean, what we are trying to do is work with those capitals and getting them to remove those caveats, but trying to get them to get every country that provides troops. And on the whole, there are now very few Western countries that provide troops, and this is one of the great tragedies. There's been a big change since your presidency, when there were mainly Westerners providing. Now it's a very different group of troops. They're not particularly well equipped in many instances, and they may have rather different motivations. And getting them to fully take on board that their role is to protect civilians is something that we try and work with them. Like, I'm not answering your question, I understand, because I don't quite know what more we can do other than work with the people who are ordering them, or at least telling them back home not to put too much effort into protecting civilians.
So, in effect, nothing can be done.
Well, yeah, you could help. I mean, you could try with that same effort, but trying with those same countries, because that is the origin of the issue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And it is tough. It's very tough because this is, you know, the governments control this, and we appreciate your being here to take these. I have some. Oh, Mrs. Carter wants to ask a question.
Why do you keep sending people from those countries when they're the ones that abuse people? Why do you send them in as peacekeepers? Do you have to let every country or something go in?
Well, one of the great contributions that President Obama did for the UN in his penultimate year was to organize a major conference on peacekeeping at the UN, specifically to try to increase our capacities and specifically to get other countries to put people forward. If we had a big bank of soldiers we could use from countries that did not abuse, we would undoubtedly use them. We struggle to meet to meet the commitments we have, and we do have restrictions. There are no DRC troops at the moment, but there are many others who I know also have committed abuses. And so it's either if we didn't use anybody who didn't commit abuses, we would have no troops. None.
None? Why not? And why not from the Western?
I think it wasn't the decision taken, wasn't it after Somalia in 1993, when the UN was wrongly blamed for the death of US Rangers in Mogadishu, 94 actually. I think a decision then was taken never to put serving personnel. As the Jordans whispered to me, there are of course some not frontline people but providing advice, but not actually peacekeepers who go out. And there was a decision never to put put US soldiers under UN command. That was a democratic administration.
I don't understand that, but I have to accept your answer.
Yeah. So what I've asked our two featured speakers that were scheduled to go next is to allow some questions for Andrew before we head to the next, we'll start the next session after the break. In order to get everyone in, if you could go right to your question for Andrew. I'm assuming if you have your flag up, it's a question for Andrew and not a general comment. Is that right? So if you have keep your flag up if you have a specific question for Andrew that's brief. Rubina.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I am Rubina Bhatti from Pakistan, and I was a leadership development practitioner since the closure of my organization last year by a police action. And now I am quote unquote recognized as a woman human rights defender at risk. So, as a woman human rights defender, my biggest fear is the fear of boundaries, whether these are geographic boundaries or ideological boundaries. And of course, boundaries are logical but paradoxical at the same time. So, let me explain my fear. While traveling from Pakistan, at the airport, they asked me who you are, and I said, I am a leadership scholar associated with University of San Diego. So I completely hide this invitation. And at the ideological front, when we use the term shrinking space, we are basically tightening our boundaries rather than making it porous. So now you are at a very high, influential position. Let me ask you a question about how do you influence the governments to make these boundaries more porous and to give the space and or share the space through making their national action plans, security plans in compliance with the international human rights mechanism. Number two, how do you influence donors to negotiate with the authoritative regimes rather than pulling them out from those countries where women human rights defenders are at risk? And my third question goes both to you and President, Honorable President, that how do you help the women human rights defenders without using the hashtag of women human rights defenders at high risk rather than women leaders or something like that? Thank you so very much.
I'm going to go ahead and take 3 questions at once and then have Andrew go. Rodney was next, and then is Yuri.
Hello. I come from a country of contradiction, Liberia, and a lot of issue that's happening, I'm afraid, is not being addressed by both the UN, and I'm hoping that, I know the Carter Center has been involved in Liberia elections for the past few years. A lot of women are being raped, and we have a female president who's on her way out, and I'm afraid this issue will not be addressed before she leaves. But although they have a court where rape issue is addressed, the victims are afraid to come out and talk about it because most of the people who do this are in government or in high position in government. So I'm hoping that the UN and the Carter Center can maybe highlight this issue, especially in the upcoming elections in Liberia. I hope there can be an agenda for some kind of discussion. Thank you.
Yuri.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Gilmer, I'm Yuri Jublaza here from Russia. I have actually 4 quick points. First, along the lines of what President Carter has said in relation to the peacekeeping operations and their human rights mandate, the same concern applies to the UNDP, to the development programs. You said that human rights are mainstreamed in the peacekeeping and development programs. However, we see that in many countries where the UNDP office is the only UN presence, these offices do not have, in practice, pursue the human rights work. Their mandate is negotiated with the host countries. They're afraid to irritate the host government and refuse to talk to civil society and raise any human rights concerns. Turkmenistan, a country with the largest number of enforced disappearances among many in the peaceful times, actually is a striking example of that. Secondly, the UN has developed, the UN human rights system has developed excellent mechanisms and tools, UPR and treaty bodies and special mandate holders, etc. But implementation is at the national level, as we all know. So the role of civil society is essential in making the recommendations, the concluding observations, the reports implemented. So when you talk about civil society, we want you to see civil society and NGOs not simply as someone who needs assistance and protection, but as vital partners on whom the UN depends in implementing all these recommendations and conclusions. And in this context, I would like to highlight the shameful Committee on Accreditation of NGOs, on civil society. You know that very well. It has been criticized. We need to raise it again and again until it is reformed. Finally, my last, well, I have to, Karen, sorry. Okay, my last point is what you do on monitoring of the human rights situations in the occupied or separatist-controlled territories, the gray zones where the occupied powers do not permit either civil society or most of international organizations to be present. Crimea is one major problem with huge human rights concerns after it has been annexed by Russia. Thank you.
Right, Rubina, your second question about influencing, I didn't hear it. About, you said authoritative, or what did you ask me about? How do I influence authoritative?
UN.
Sorry?
You know, like the regimes, governments are now introducing national action plan in the name of security and war on terror and stuff like that. And those plans are not in compliance with international human rights frameworks. So how do you influence those governments to make their plans in compliance with that?
With difficulty is the short answer. I mean, it's just that our whole engagement with governments like that is always very tricky. But one tries to make the point, not always with tremendous optimism, that it's going to work. I mean, Egypt, for example, would be a particular case in point. I mean, one goes with them, and I've raised in particular this issue of the of a law that's going to be passed on NGOs and other issues. But going to them, just as an example, to try and tell them that this is against your own constitution, Article 19 of your own constitution, they will all nod if they're being polite, and they may send it back. One works with people and try to persuade them, but these are people, and it relates to Yuri's point as well, on the accreditation of the NGO committee, that are intrinsically hostile to any interaction with us whatsoever. So going to them and telling them they've been naughty and that they're, which is what we do, but you can imagine that it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact because we haven't got the leverage that is required to do that. On the accreditation, Yuri, it is awful that, and we've given a lot of thought at the fact, and those who don't know, that there's this NGO committee at the UN which, whereby member states decide whether NGOs can be accredited, and they have a very political agenda, and their agenda is not human rights. It is their agenda is whether organizations are somehow likely to criticize them when they get there, and if they have a majority of that committee, again, there's little we can do to supersede that. I mean, and the problem at the UN at the moment is that majority is growing, and it's whether in the Security Council it is growing. That they now don't. You now cannot get 9 votes in the Security Council, which is what you need for a procedural motion to have a human rights debate. So the numbers are going against us. Rodney, on women being raped, it is a huge issue, and in fact I'm going to Liberia later this month, and maybe we could have a word on that. I don't have an immediate, I mean, it wasn't actually a question, was it? You just said it needs to be an agenda, and I couldn't agree more. On Crimea, on occupying powers, well, that's one that we're particularly working on at the moment, because the Human Rights Council asked us to do a report on Crimea. Now we have 0 access to Crimea, but we've made it very clear, I've said it in public at the Human Rights Council, that whether or not, and we've asked for access repeatedly, whether or not we get it, we're still going to do it. Of course, it's based on hearsay, which then allows the people concerned to say, well, it's false, and to which our response is, it's back and forth, well, if you let us in, that would be great. If you don't, it means you have something to hide. And that is increasingly our line in public and in private. Those who don't let us in have something to hide. And that also is happening more and more.
We're right up to the break, but I've got Phoebe and Pastor Esther and Najla. If you make it very quick, all three of you can get in.
Thank you. Appreciate your remarks. I'm feeling a great deal of compassion for the UN at this moment, and I will say why. One of the recurring themes during our last 3 days together is how those of us in the human rights community are feeling very frustrated with the lack of support from the UN. However, having worked within the UN system myself for some time, I'm very aware of how it's really about governments at the end of the day. It's a multilateral, government-driven entity, and unless there's leadership from governments themselves to enforce human rights, we're going to continue to see the system not work very effectively. So my question is really around where do you see some potential leadership levers that we can take advantage of? We've all been acknowledging over the last few days that the US is really no longer the leader that it once was for human rights, and we're really looking to what are the other governments that we can ally with that will take up our cause and that have a strong place within the UN system to push our agendas. So I'd really love your feedback on that. And in terms of the ECOSOC issue, I completely hear your point. And once again, that does bring up the issue of who are the governments we can look to really champion our cause. My own organization has spent the last 5 years trying to get ECOSOC accreditation, even though we have countless times partnered with UN Women, done co-authored reports with UNDP and UNFPA, UNICEF, et cetera. So we are feeling very discouraged and just really need to find some new leadership within to support us. Thank you.
Okay, Pastor Esther and then Najla, and then we'll give Andrew a chance to wrap up.
Thank you very much. My name is Esther Ibanga. I pastor a church in Jos in the Middle Belt. My question is really, I'm just curious about at what point does the UN intervene in almost genocidal killings going on in a particular place? When I look at my community and what's going on, I cannot help but think about Rwanda and how we said never again. And yet Rwanda is being repeated in different parts of Africa, and I'm just wondering, did we really learn anything from Rwanda? I live in a community where I had been a pastor for like 22 years until 6 years ago when I had to leave the four corners of the church and go into the community to begin to work with young people that are prone to violence and to see how we can work with preventing extremism. Now, what happened was a village close to where I lived, was attacked by militants, and they killed about 530 women and children in the most hideous manner. I met a woman, and I still know her, she's still alive, who lost 7 members of her family in that attack. And these kinds of attack has spread not just in Jos, Plateau State, but in the whole of the Middle Belt. It has spread to Benue State, to Nasarawa State. Now it is herdsmen killing Christians. And it seems like this is beyond the state government to deal with. The federal government has not done anything either, So I just wonder, at what point do we expect the UN to intervene? When is it enough for them to come in?
Finally, Najla, and then Andrew will finish up.
Hello, this is Najla from Afghanistan. My question is, after the withdrawal of international community, particularly the US military from Afghanistan in 2014, unfortunately, suddenly, most of the UN offices in the entire of the country was sized down, and plus they have closed their offices, which they started to create a panic among the civil society organizations, and lots of people lost their jobs, and also the human rights defenders, there was the space was shrinking for them also to lose one of their supporters as a woman, as a UN organization. So this is one of my questions, whether what is your response in that regard? Why the UN is after the withdrawal? Why the UN is also withdrawing their offices from conflict zones. I understand because of the security, but at the same time, demoralizing the organizations and the activists. And at the same time, my second question, I know this is okay, I have to do it. There are private prisons in Afghanistan, particularly by US military. So what is the role of, how is the role, what role UN plays, particularly in monitoring and evaluation of abuses of the rights and torture of these civilians? Not all of them are terrorists, or not all of them are Taliban that they captured. Unfortunately, most of them are coming. So this was my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Like a drowning man who grabs anything he can, I will grab Phoebe's compassion. It's rare to hear anyone express compassion for the UN, but actually her point is really crucial, because the sort of, what not everybody appreciates, that it's obviously a body of member states. Yesterday, Rahana led an applause when Brian mentioned, oh, the UN shouldn't just be seen as governments. It has, I can't remember the exact phrase. And of course, it would be very nice, and the Charter begins with the peoples, but it is an intergovernmental body. That's what it is. And, but those of us who work for it often share almost entirely 100% of what people like you would say, and we're not always able to say that so explicitly. But so what can I say there? Phoebe, your question was, who do we ally with, given that the US has moved away from its totally supportive role, which is what it was in the last previous years?
Yes, and other countries that are now moving in the populist and authoritarian direction.
Yeah, and those who are still good are less, who are not moving that way, are actually less powerful than they were. I mean, the Europeans are obviously the people now who are a repository of many of our human rights values. But one problem, and maybe your question can help lead us out of there, is that many people see the human rights agenda as a Western agenda. And what we need to do, and I think actually everybody needs to do, particularly human rights organizations, is to try and move that debate away, so that when you ally, and there are other countries who are not totally repressive, but who sign up to the general G77 line. Senegal, for example, signed up, voted not to have that debate that we had in the Security Council a couple of weeks ago, not because I think it's passionately against human rights, just because that was the consensus line of the African group and the G77. There are many countries there who could be worked on, and we could discuss particular names. They probably wouldn't like to be mentioned in public, because they have to show their solidarity with their regional grouping. But there are countries, and I think we do need to work to move that narrative of it being a Western agenda. Esther, at what point does a UN intervene when there are genocidal killings? It is simple. The UN intervenes either when a country asks, when the government asks for it, or when the Security Council deploys it. The great problem, and you've referred to one, but there are obviously many others where we are very, very either never show up at all or too late, is because the government didn't want to invite, because it didn't, the last thing it wanted was interference and witnesses into what it was doing, or just embarrassment that they didn't want to see that they couldn't control the situation, or alternatively, the council didn't take action either through just feeling, well, because it's just so much easier not to get involved than to send an expensive peacekeeping operation, even though we all know that sending it in advance saves far more in the long run. But that also relates to Laj's question as to why does the UN withdraw from a conflict zone? Is it security? No, it's not just security. It withdraws for budgetary reasons. There is a real movement led now by the US, but actually the French and the British go along with it as well, that where a peacekeeping operation has sort of either been successful or has achieved most of its aims, and three are winding down, Haiti, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire, there's a real desire to show for budgetary reasons and for others that look, great, you put some people in there and they don't last forever, and that therefore it's a finite process. So there is that feeling that, and even Samantha Power, who was a tremendous exponent of peacekeeping and indeed human rights, she was very keen, that it's important to close a mission when it's over, and to prove that it is possible to do that. What we try to do in the Human Rights Office, and in all three of the countries I've just mentioned, we are trying to ensure that there is a Human Rights Office there, but there won't be peacekeepers. That decision is taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for being, oh yes.
Andrew, I want to thank you personally again, because I see the difficulty you have in trying to explain what I learned as president, and that is that the United Nations can't order a sovereign nation to do something against that sovereign nation's desire. And you can use the combined efforts of some official organizations, like the High Commission and so forth, but they have very limited authority, and also to phase out your peacekeeping efforts. One of the reasons is because of a budgetary requirements. When you get through carrying out a charge, it's time for you to withdraw. And so we understand that you have very limited authority over a sovereign nation, even including the United States, because I saw some of my successes, particularly when we passed laws about what the United Nations could do. Our Georgia's U.S. Senate would not approve any action by the United Nations that would impede or contradict actions taken by the U.S. government. So the United States has to play a secondary role, but the reason we are so insistent on criticizing is we look on the United Nations still as a kind of a court of last resort. When the governments themselves want to do it, everybody thinks the United Nations ought to be able to do it, and we understand from your comments, very carefully chosen and very adequately explained, that the United Nations has limited authority over sovereign nations, some of whom are direct human rights violators. So thank you very much for your courageous effort to defend a weak organization depend on.
Thank you. We are now going to take a break, but please be back in your seats right at 11:45 so we can resume. There were some speakers from yesterday that I still have to call on, but we're going to go ahead and start with our next session, and I will bring you into that discussion. Thank you very much.